Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cheng, I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, you talk a little bit about the racist roots of gun control. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit further on this and talk to us a little bit about the disproportionate harms that you think can be inflicted on minority groups of various stripes, including LGBTQ communities, by gun control, aggressive gun control policies of the sort that are often pushed these days, including things like universal background checks and increased waiting periods.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So I think a lot of gun control laws under consideration that are passed are always well-intentioned, right? Well-meaning, and I think we are all united in the fact that we want to reduce the violence that we see in our country. Like I mentioned with Executive Order 9066 as one of many examples, it was under that executive order was ordered under the guise of public safety and national security. Yet it took a marginalized community, our Japanese American citizens, and unconstitutionally put them in internment camps. I think the main point is we have this tendency to create the other, right? And when we otherize people, we stop treating them like human beings, and then we stop saying that they have the rights bestowed upon them by the US Constitution. And so whether it's with Japanese Americans or any other Asian Americans or LGBTQ Americans, it's us today, but it's going to be someone else tomorrow. So this isn't just a problem for the Asian American community or the LGBT community, but when there are gun control bills under consideration, it threatens every single American's right to defend themselves from real imminent threats. And that's what frightens me about the gun control legislation in front of this body today.
Very often, not only in American history, but even prior to American history, we've seen that it's rarely the empowered, very rarely the wealthy or those with political connections to the government who have their rights interfered with. This goes back many centuries. Charles II in England, in something called the Game Act, enacted in 1671, it took away gun rights of commoners. 17 years later, in 1688, William and Mary brought into the English Bill of Rights legislation that protected gun ownership rights for commoners, but made clear that it applied only to Protestants. In other words, those who are disenfranchised, those who are not among the wealthy elite or the most well-connected, are usually those in any society, certainly going back hundreds of years in our legal traditions. Those are very often not the people whose rights are most seriously restricted. The wealthy and the well-connected end up doing okay. Now, Dr. Hupp, I appreciate you joining us today, and it's good to hear your voice again and to hear your insights on this. Your story is nothing short of tragic and heartbreaking. Now, the right of individual Americans to keep and bear arms was appropriately considered by our founding fathers so fundamental and so associated with the English legal tradition that informed their decision-making that they chose to put it into the Constitution in the Second Amendment. Recently, my home state of Utah became the 17th state to enact constitutional concealed carry legislation, allowing anyone 21 years of age or older who's legally allowed to possess a firearm to concealed carry, subject to certain exceptions. Dr. Hupp, could you explain why you think it's in the public interest, setting aside for a moment the constitutional questions, but why is it in the public interest to allow all law-abiding Americans to carry firearms?
Oh, heavens, that becomes so deep. I think you and Mr. Cheng put it very clearly when you're looking at the broader picture. I know that historically bad things can happen, and I think it's a preventive for a future despotic actions. Makes it very difficult for someone to come in and do bad things to groups of people when they can fight back. As individuals, I think we see so many people who are in persecuted classes. I think the what is it now? The LBGQ. I forget all the letters now, but I think those persecuted classes are particularly in need of protection, personal protection. I think it's important that the bad guys don't know where the guns are. I think that the more that we see these mass shootings, we're seeing them in places where people, again, are not allowed to protect themselves. I think when we see them in schools, that's a perfect example. It's always bothered me that my sister's a teacher. She can protect herself at the Walmart, across the street from the school, where there are mothers pushing strollers. And yet, for some reason, society has said, we don't trust you the minute you cross the street and go into your classroom. And yet, that's where the bad guys go to kill people. So I think the more good people that are armed, the better.
In other words, a lot of this has to do with the fact that if we didn't have these rights, the government would have a certain monopoly on the use of force. Now, if you live in a neighborhood that's well secured, that's behind a gate, if you can afford your own private security, or if you're in a neighborhood that, for one reason or another, the police monitor regularly, this might have a very different set of implications than it would if you don't live in one of those communities. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would agree with that. And I've noticed that many of the people that are supportive of gun control have their own security details. Unfortunately, I don't have that.
Charles II and William and Mary certainly had their own as well. Thank you.